I've had a number of people ask me if I would talk about Remington, Remington 700, Remington 600 triggers. There's been a considerable amount of hoopla for quite a number of years over Remington triggers. There's been situations where rifles have went off, things didn't work perfectly. There have been lawsuits, but I've never heard any real information about the whole situation. And so it's left quite a few people with questions. And this is why I've chose to talk about this, because I think I know something about it. I think I know something about it because I've adjusted, worked on, and installed triggers in Remington 700s, taken them apart, cleaned them, and one thing and another for all the years that I've been building rifles. One of the first things that was done wrong when those rifle triggers were put together, they put a brown colored grease in the trigger. Well, this is the very last thing on this earth that you want in a trigger is grease. The trigger should be clean. The trigger should be dry. Now, if you know anything about any of our grease, Remington 700s have been made, since the early 60s. The Remington 700, the 721s and 722s were redesigned. The rifles were redesigned. The triggers were somewhat redesigned, before 1962. And anyway, I've worked on 721, 722, 700, 600 triggers. And over time, I encountered issues. I encountered problems. One of the first things was that grease. The grease solidifies in the trigger mechanism, and it becomes sticky. It becomes even hard, and it freezes up a trigger. Well, what in the world do you think is going to happen with grease that this has happened to? It's not going to allow the mechanisms, the springs, to be able to return that trigger to battery. The internal works of the trigger, the sear in the trigger, is not going to allow it to return to battery to be able to recock the rifle. So what happens? You close the bolt, the gun goes off. Oh boy, this is a scary situation. I've been there, I've seen it, I've experienced it. Even today, when I get a Remington in here from early years, I take the trigger apart and I clean it. I get all that old grease out of there with a solvent. And I blow it out with air, and I put it back together, and I properly adjust it. Now here's the other aspect. We got a lot of wannabes out here that want to adjust their own trigger. They have no clue of the geometry, the makings of the trigger. They start adjusting screws. And 99% of the time, they adjust the wrong screws to get what they think that they want. And one of the first things that they do is wrongly adjust the over travel screw on the Remington trigger. That's the screw that's on the front of the trigger at the top. When the sears break and allows the firing pin to fall, there has to be some over travel. In other words, that sear has to clear by about 10 to 15 thousandths for it to fairly and squarely return to battery time after time for a lifetime, provided that the springs will hold up and maintain their temper and strength over a lifetime. The other aspect is I get lots of rifles in here that when I take it out of the box, the bolt's cocked. Well, think about it, folks. If you had 2 tons of gravel in the back end of your pickup for 10 years, and finally you took the 2 tons of gravel out of the back end of your pickup, you think those springs would return to what they were 10 years before? No. It basically weakens the spring. Weakens the spring on your pickup truck, just as it weakens the spring in your rifle trigger, folks. You don't leave your rifle cocked. Here's what you do. You take your left hand, if you're a right-hand man, and put your hand on the pistol grip, and you hold the trigger back, and you run the bolt forward and you close it. And of course, you need to make sure that you don't have any cartridges in the magazine, that this is not a loaded rifle. You've had to take the cartridges out of the magazine or depress the cartridges in the magazine to ride the bolt over the top of the cartridges to close the bolt. You don't put your rifle away cocked. So, you see, I've described 3 things. Putting the rifle away cocked, weaken the spring, so it can't return the sear to cock the rifle. I've explained the wrong adjustment that completely restricts the sears, not allowing them to return to battery to cock the rifle. And I've described the solidification of the grease over time in the trigger. Now, we're going to go to another area of the trigger. The bottom screw on the front of the trigger is the poundage screw to give you your poundage. And there's a spring behind there that maintains tension to return the sear. There has to be a spring there. How do you think that things are going to work? And this is another area that is adjusted wrong. If you've adjusted this too light, and you've wrongly adjusted your over travel screw on the top front of the trigger, restricting the sear, and you've left your bolt cocked since last hunting season, you've probably got a problem. And the problem is yours. But people just, the first thing when something happens, they want to find somebody to blame. They don't want to take any responsibility for themselves, and this is what's led to these lawsuits. Now, the next thing is the screw on the back of the trigger. The screw on the back of the trigger adjusts the actual sear engagement. And there's a little hole on the left-hand side of the housing of the trigger. And you can see visually the sear engagement. And there has to be enough sear engagement. There has to be enough poundage on the adjustment screw for the poundage on the bottom front of the trigger, and there's got to be enough clearance at the over travel screw on the top front of the trigger for everything to work properly. You see, I'm describing every aspect of the geometry of this trigger and how in the hell that the trigger works. Now, I don't feel that the Remington triggers were ever faulty in design. But because of people unable to listen, people unable to understand, have the ability to pay attention, this has led to some unnecessary circumstances, some unnecessary situations to do with lawsuits, and one thing and another. I've had absolutely dozens, probably around 3 dozen triggers in this shop that came in here, rifles came in here with things that weren't working. It was all faulty. And it was always one of the 3 situations that I've described, or 4 situations, to do with the 3 adjustment screws and or the grease and or leaving the rifle cocked. Maybe all those situations multiplied over time has created the problem. Now, this led to a redesign here a few years ago of Remington trigger. It's one of the poorest damn triggers that ever come down the pike. The early Remington triggers were never faulty in design at all if properly worked on. And you really don't have any business taking screwdrivers or wrenches or anything else and messing around with a rifle trigger unless you understand what in the world you're doing. And I've had rifles in here that came from other shops, other places, both within the area and 1,500, 2,000 miles from here. And it's always the same situations. Everything that I've described, it's always the same thing as why there's something wrong with the trigger. Is because whomever it is just started working on a trigger. Guy might have been working on and messing with these triggers for 30 years, but he still doesn't know what the hell he's doing. I know people here locally. I know a man here that's in his 90s that's been working on guns for 60 some years. And we had this discussion a long time ago. He didn't have a clue about 15 years ago what was wrong with the triggers at 75 years old. He didn't have a clue. Well, he shouldn't have even been working on them. So you need to understand what we've got. Now, as a rule, when I build a rifle, I put an aftermarket trigger in. I put either a Timney trigger in, a Rifle Basics trigger in, or a Trigger Tech trigger in it. And for years I used Canchar, and I've used a few others that have come around over the years and one thing another. Now I'm going to describe something else to you. There's still a situation with any of these triggers that the actual mechanism of the trigger is confined in an enclosed housing. Each side of the trigger has a sheet metal plate on it, and things are either screwed together or riveted together, and those parts, those working parts, have to work inside that housing. Now, quite a number of years ago, probably 24 years ago or something like that, 20 some odd years anyway, my son and I were hunting of a morning, and I'd had my rifle for a number of days. When I was done hunting, I'd stick it in the rack, in the gun rack, behind the seat of the pickup. And we had some really cold mornings, and some mornings were 20 below zero. And we headed out of here before daylight and got into country where there were elk. And we saw some elk, and I got out and pulled my rifle from behind the seat and walked to a big, huge boulder and leaned against that boulder. And I lifted the bolt handle and pushed the bolt forward. And I'm a very, very observant fella. I don't miss much. And as I started my downward motion of that bolt with a loaded cartridge in the chamber, I saw the firing pin start down. Well, I knew something was haywire. I lifted the bolt handle, I tried it again, and the same thing happened again. Well, here's what I did. I knew that my trigger was not working properly. Now, that trigger was completely clean, free of any kind of debris or any lubricant or anything whatsoever. But it'd been behind the seat in the pickup. And that trigger was froze up at 20 some below zero. Those metal parts in so close contact to one another, you look at metal in the morning, you look at your windshield in the morning when it's 20 below zero, look at the ice on your windshield and the ice on your vehicle. Well, that's what I had. I had ice on that trigger. It was froze up. I'll tell you what I did. I positioned the rifle on top of my cap on that boulder. I lined the rifle up reasonably well. I took my left hand. I took my thumb and I held it on the back of the trigger to keep the trigger forward. And I slowly closed the bolt and the rifle clocked, and I lined it up with the cow elk, and I shot that cow elk just like that. I made it work, but my trigger was froze. Now, this doesn't happen to Winchester Model 70 triggers. of the earlier vintage before they came around with this new design trigger that's also built in a housing. All those working parts of a Winchester Model 70, pre to these latest Series 2 type triggers, Mark II, X-Pro damn triggers, you see, they were not built in a housing. Those things didn't freeze up. They worked with dirt. They worked come hell or high water, because it's the best working man's rifle that's ever come down the pike is a Winchester Model 70. And anyway, that's just a comparison compared to a Remington trigger with all the parts in an enclosed housing. So those are facts as I see them. And all this is simply my opinion based on thousands of jobs that I've worked on, Remington rifles that I've worked on, and triggers. So I don't know as though you're going to find this information out from anybody else. I don't think you're going to. I think that there's perhaps an individual or two out there that has actually picked up on this some time ago or years ago. But for the most part, it's been kind of a crazy ride over this Remington situation. And as we know, various parts at this point in time, from information that are being filtered down, there's various parts of the Remington holdings that are being sold off to other companies and one thing another. And I don't know. I haven't heard that anybody's actually bought the Remington as we know it, Remington rifles and so forth. I don't think anybody's bought that, but there's other aspects that have been sold off. The bullet end was sold off. With Barnes was sold to Sierra, and the holdings, the Marlin holdings was bought by somebody else, and Federal Ammunition bought the Remington name and the Remington ammunition, the rights to manufacture Remington ammunition and so forth. But it remains to be seen where this goes. It hasn't been an easy situation, and one thing another for Remington. But those are facts as I see them, and there's some information for you that you might not know. And it was in print here a few days ago. But anyway, that's how I see it, folks.